So workers at Sydney Water have not been paid properly following a new payroll system being introduced without consultation. Our members have told us they're stressed and anxious about paying the rent, paying the mortgage, putting food on the table. This is an outrageous way for any employer to treat their workers, let alone one of the biggest public water utilities in the country. Now, despite everything we have done to try to sort this out, we still have serious and real concerns about our members' upcoming payroll this week. Our members and their families cannot wait. We're calling on the government to step in to help us to fix this. We've lodged a dispute urgently at the Fair Work Commission. Our members work hard every single day. They deserve so much better than this.
That's a pretty damning YouTube short that just was published recently about the Sydney Water payroll ERP failure, and just a bad look for not only the project itself, but certainly for Sydney Water as an organization. It's a bad look for everyone involved. And of course, it's a very unfortunate situation for employees of Sydney Water who are not getting paid on time, who are not getting paid the right amount in many cases. And they're all facing a certain amount of uncertainty as it relates to their paychecks, which if there's one thing you don't want to mess with in technology, it's people's pay. And that's exactly what Sydney Water is experiencing. And that's a symptom of a deeper problem. We're going to cover a lot of what some of these problems are here in episode 283 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you.
3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Hello, welcome to episode number 283 of Transformation Ground Control. This is the tech-agnostic podcast that covers people, process, technology, and strategy. Everything you need to know to make your digital transformation successful. And we do it without the tech spin, without the marketing spin, and without all the sugar-coated unicorn and rainbow perspectives of what could be in the rare instance if you are successful with the digital transformation. But instead, what we talk about is what the risks are and how you can overcome some of those risks. And that's a big part of what we'll cover here in episode 283. Before we jump in, though, and get into today's conversation, I want to go back to this Sydney Water debacle. Just happened a couple weeks ago where they went live with the new Dayforce payroll system. Long story short, it sounds like it was a complete mess. Thousands of employees getting paid, or hundreds of employees getting paid late, in some cases getting paid the wrong amounts, in some cases not being paid at all. And that video I just played you at the top of the episode before the intro was from the ASU, which is a labor union based out of Australia. So now you've got the labor union all worked up. They're calling on the Australian government to step in and intervene. And as of the time I'm recording this video, I'm not sure what Sydney Water is doing to address this issue and fix the problem. I imagine they're probably going to have some manual workarounds, maybe even revert back to their old system. I think if I remember correctly, one of the articles I read about this was talking about how the union is suggesting that they just go back to the old system that they were on before, the old payroll system before they went live with Dayforce. So big mess here in Australia. I certainly feel for those employees that aren't getting paid on time, getting paid the wrong amounts, or if they're just nervous about getting paid. I mean, so many people live paycheck to paycheck and don't have the luxury of not caring or it not mattering if they get paid or not. But I think the bigger issue here, and the thing that this really stoked in my mind and really triggered in my mind, was that so often when we talk about failure, and in this podcast included, in my own thought leadership YouTube videos included, I sometimes fall prey or fall victim to just focusing myopically on the financial impact, how it affects a business and how it affects their operations and the difficulty it creates for the organization as a whole. But what this is a stark reminder of, this Sydney Water case, is that many times, in most cases, ERP failures affect people in a very real way. Now, maybe you're not affecting their payroll as dramatically as Sydney Water is experiencing right now, but at the very least, you're creating psychological stress and just chaos and morale issues and things that don't show up in the project status reports. They're usually things that don't show up in the project budget or the timeline. But this is real harm that organizations oftentimes cause with their digital transformations. And so I think if you're a leader involved in a digital transformation, yeah, you want to focus on budget and timeline and capabilities and milestones and all that important stuff that is very important. You need to keep doing that. But I think leaders need to spend a lot more time looking at how their projects, their actions, their decisions affect their own employees. And I think it gets easy to get lost in the details of what we're doing day to day on the project, or to get caught up in philosophical debates around, do we build versus buy, do we customize or not, all important stuff. But a lot of times we're doing those or making those decisions in the context of purely financial and strategic decisions, without necessarily looking at how are these decisions going to affect our people? How will things look to our people when we flip the switch at Go Live? What's the risk that we're imposing on our people? And I would challenge each of you involved in a digital transformation, ask yourselves that question. Every decision I've made so far in this project, for better or for worse, how is it affecting people, and how might it affect people? How might it affect the culture of the organization, the morale, the psychological safety and stress and all that stuff of people? It just oftentimes gets overlooked. And yeah, we might think we're going to cover it all in training and make everyone feel good in training. But if you're waiting until training to really address the people side of things, or to really think long and hard about the people side of things, then you're waiting way too long. So love to hear your feedback on that comment, or that thread right there, in terms of, have you asked yourselves that question? Have you asked that question? Have you come across anything in your experience, in your project, where you recognize that there are challenges there? So love to hear your feedback there. And today we've got a really good episode for you. We're going to have Marcus Harris on the show here in a few minutes. We're going to talk about intellectual property, which on the surface, I'll be honest, the topic of intellectual property does not sound sexy or interesting to me on the surface. But the more I dig into this, and the more I think about and analyze and understand what customers are doing unknowingly, in most cases, with their intellectual property, and the way they're putting their intellectual property at risk, is very alarming. And I think it's very relevant, and something that every executive needs to hear. Every leader that's sitting in a boardroom making decisions around, how they're going to govern a project, or how they're going to make decisions that affect their organizations for years and decades to come. I think you have to listen to this conversation, because it's so important. It's something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough in digital transformation projects. It certainly doesn't get discussed in vendor marketing materials that's out there. Industry analysts aren't really talking about it either. So someone's got to talk about it. I'd rather talk about it here in a podcast rather than have you talking to me about it, in a project recovery or project rescue sort of situation. It's a lot cheaper for you to listen to this podcast than to hire our team later to fix it later. But what I will say is that we're going to talk about intellectual property today. And one of the training topics that we'll touch upon here in today's conversation is the control war over your ERP data, and how that's heating up. And that ties in very much to what we're going to talk about with Marcus. But there's a couple things that I want to use to frame the conversation with Marcus and this whole thread of intellectual property. There's two recent events. First, SAP, if you hadn't heard, SAP reached a settlement with the EU that forced concessions around third-party maintenance. And this is a very big development. I think it's a very positive development, in my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I know I've heard mixed stuff from people when I've made that comment. But if you're in the SAP community, whether you're an SAP consultant, you work for a vendor, if you're a customer, love to hear what you think about this EU settlement with the SAP, with SAP. If you don't know about it, I encourage you to go check it out, but I'll give you a quick summary here. But the reality here is that that now SAP has agreed as a concession to the EU that in the EU, non-SAP support providers can be used by SAP customers without getting penalized. In other words, SAP will no longer penalize SAP customers who decide to go find third-party maintenance, whereas in the past they had pretty, I'd call it aggressive pricing tactics and back pricing for customers that choose to go a different route than SAP Direct for their maintenance services. So this is a big win for customers. It's definitely a big win for Rimini Street, Spinnaker Support, and some of these other third-party support providers. I actually think it's probably a win for SAP in the long term, because SAP's got to do something here to rebuild trust with their customers. I've just never seen such a powerhouse company with such disdain amongst their customer base. I mean, there's so many customers we talk to that are just really unhappy with SAP as a company. They like the product. They like, in most cases, they love ECC. They're perfectly content with ECC. But now as they make this journey to S4HANA, which is the more recent version of SAP, there's just a lot of distrust in the ecosystem. I think it's going to harm SAP long term. SAP needs to figure out a way to be more customer centric and friendly. You can do that and still be profitable, still make your investors happy. You don't need to be as aggressive as SAP has been, in my opinion. So that's good news. EU and SAP agree on the settlement to where now getting third-party support in the SAP world is more feasible. It's less of a penalty from SAP. And if you're not in the EU, I would still point to the EU settlement as an expectation you have of SAP. So if you're in the Americas and Asia Pacific, wherever you are, I would point to that EU settlement and say, look, you're doing this in the EU. You made these concessions in the EU. I want that same agreement here, wherever you are. So relevant to you, whether you're in the EU or not. The second thing that's worth talking about that's very relevant to today's conversation with Marcus is SAP has recently published a new API policy that restricts how third-party tools can access and integrate with data in S/4HANA. Now, I've talked about this before on this podcast. If you recall me talking about it before, you'll probably know, and you might guess that I'm not a fan of this policy, this API policy that's restricting how third-party tools can access and integrate with data in S/4HANA. Now, the reason I don't like this is because SAP says it's due to it's security. They're doing it for security reasons because they can't have just any system accessing S/4HANA. Yeah, no, I'm not buying it. You're not going to convince me that that's the real reason. I know SAP well enough to know that the real reason is most likely that they want you using SAP products. They don't want you using third-party AI tools or third-party integration tools that are not owned by SAP. In other words, if you're not expanding the SAP footprint and you're not spending more money with SAP, they're not going to be as excited about you deploying that software. And to prove my point that this is what I think SAP is really basing it on, there's actually litigation that's related to this that involves Celonis. Celonis is a business process mining software provider. So business process mining, if you don't know, it's a technology you can install or use within your organization, and it'll use a web-based tool to go essentially crawl your systems, your technologies that you're using, and it'll look at the transactional databases and tell you what your actual processes are, what your actual cycle times are. It'll just show you how people are really using the system in terms of the volume of transactions, the deviations from what you think are the standard transactions, the time it's taking to complete certain process flows. It gives you actual data based on the systems you're using. So Celonis provides this business process mining tool. Celonis had historically been able to access S/4HANA along with other ERP systems. And when I say S/4HANA, I'm not sure if, to be clear, I'm not sure if this is related to S/4HANA, if it's related to ECC or both. So let me just paraphrase or rephrase that by saying that it's related to SAP products. I'm not 100% clear on which exact ones, but Celonis is suing SAP over this issue that in the past, Celonis had been able to access and tap into SAP products to do its business process mining, but then SAP bought a competitor of Celonis called Signavio. Now SAP owns Signavio, and they've since said that Celonis can no longer access SAP data. So now Celonis is suing over this. And so again, SAP says it's about security, but a lot of people, myself included, think it's about control. They're trying to steer you into SAP sanctioned products and away from third-party competition. That's my personal opinion. I have no legal basis to make that claim, in court or whatever without further analysis. But on the surface, that's what it looks like to me. But here's the big question I have for you. Whether you think it's SAP's right or not to limit Celonis in particular, let's talk more broadly. Do you think SAP or any software vendor should be able to control how you use your own data? And I'm going to be very clear and call it your data. When I say you, I mean you, the end customer. I'm not talking about, it's not SAP data. Note that I'm not saying SAP's data. I'm saying customers' data. So whether or not you're an SAP customer, this matters a lot because the question underneath all this is pretty simple and pretty profound. And that is, once your data lives in a vendor's cloud, who actually controls it? You or them? Who should control it? Who actually does and who should control the data in the system, the software vendor or you? I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments below. Let me know what you think. Who owns data in a cloud system, the vendor or you? Let me know what you think below. So while you're digesting that, while you're thinking about that, the answer to that question, I'm going to be joined today by Marcus Harris. He's joining me from Taft Law. He's a software attorney. He's a former in-house counsel at both SAP and Infor. And he's the most frequent guest we've ever had on the show. We're going to go deep into intellectual property in the cloud and AI era And here's a twist. It's not just a legal conversation. You don't have to be in litigation or concerned about contracts to care about what we're going to talk about. I want to ask him a bunch of questions that, yes, they do have contractual and legal implications, but we're going to get into this gray area of intellectual property and competitive advantage and secret sauce and data. There's a lot of stuff in what we're going to talk about here today. But in this conversation, we're going to show you how companies are quietly and slowly giving away control of their competitive advantages, their secret sauce, without even realizing it. Now, before I bring Marcus on here in just a minute, one more thing I want to mention before he comes on is Digital Stratosphere 2026. It's our annual tech agnostic conference. It's coming up in September. It's coming up fast. I can't believe it's already just a few weeks away. September 9th through 11th in Denver, Colorado. It's 3 days of no spin, vendor neutral conversations on ERP, AI, and digital transformation. And Marcus, who is about to join us, is one of our keynote speakers. His company, Taft is also a sponsor. He has spoken at and sponsored every single Stratosphere since the beginning of doing these conferences. So you can go to stratosphere2026.com, use the promo code earlybird20 for 20% off. You can join in person in Denver, or if you aren't able to make it physically in person, which you hope you can, but if you can't, you can also join remotely, virtually, online as well. We'll stream it live. We'll take audience questions in person and virtually. So be sure to join us. So let's get into it. Let's get into the conversation with Marcus Harris. Again, Marcus Harris, he's an attorney at Taft Law. He has the distinct honor and, I dare I say, privilege of being the most frequent guest on this podcast. And he's also the most frequent speaker we've had at our Digital Stratosphere conference as well. So Marcus, thanks for being here today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I always enjoy talking to you, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be the most frequent guest on your show. And we always have good conversations. And I think, we were talking a little bit before we jumped on here, and I think, we could talk about these things for, hours. And we probably should have recorded some of our conversation previously, but I'm excited to talk about those things. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney with a particular focus on drafting and negotiating ERP-related contracts and litigating failed ERP projects and digital transformations, really nationwide, in courts and before arbitration panels. And I think I was in-house at a couple of software companies, SAP and Infor, early in my career. And so, I got a little bit of a unique perspective on some of these issues and the way that the vendors typically will look at these issues. And today, my practice, we're on the other side of these transactions on a consistent basis, both transactionally, contract negotiation-wise, and litigation-wise. So, I hope we can bring some value here. These are great topics. Well, it's a great topic, and I think incredibly timely for people to have an understanding of the risks and issues associated with their data and intellectual property.
Yeah. In fact, it's so much fun to talk about that. As you said, before we went live, we looked up and all of a sudden realized we'd been talking, and we're 15 minutes late going live here on air because we were just chit-chatting and talking about all the stuff that we're about to talk about right now. So anyway, we're both very passionate about it. I know you are, Marcus, and I love having you on the show because you have an uncanny way of being able to explain this stuff to the layman, someone who's not an attorney, to understand it in a different way. But before we get into some of the questions I've got, and I also want to hear from the audience too, any questions you have for Marcus or I related to this topic here today, please drop those in the chat. I'll keep an eye on all the streams that we're streaming here today, TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, etc., Facebook, X. We're streaming to a lot of different platforms. So drop in the chat any questions you have. And also, if you don't mind just dropping in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. It's always good to see where in the world everyone's at. But before we get into some of the questions from the audience and myself, I know, Marcus, you've been doing this for 20 years, negotiating tech contracts, litigating failed ERP projects. You also worked in-house as internal legal counsel, both at SAP and Infor. Yeah. And from that vantage point, what do most companies fundamentally misunderstand about who owns their IP once they move to the cloud?
Yeah, I think companies really fundamentally misunderstand that this concept of moving to the cloud really means, in a very real way, that they're giving up control. Okay, they're giving up control of what I would view as their most valuable commodity, which is their intellectual property. They're relying on the processes that have been in place by whatever ERP vendor they're utilizing, whatever third-party vendors that ERP is utilizing. And I think you got to conceptualize this as, you're renting infrastructure or software to some extent, right? But in reality, you look at the way that these vendors deal with this cloud scenario, and you've got kind of this layered ownership of, I would say layered ownership and control of your intellectual property, the way that their intellectual property integrates with your data. You've got concepts associated with licensing back your customer data, meaning that you enter in your proprietary information, customer data, into the system. You give a license to that vendor to utilize it, which is going to be very broad in scope, and they're going to be able to do fundamentally different things than you're actually realizing that they can do because of the nature of that license grant. They're able to create potentially derivative works of that material. They're able to use it to train their models on, and so you've got this kind of layered system of what you actually retain control of your data to do, in really a loss of control. And I think that fundamentally is not something that anybody's really thinking about. They think, well, it's our system, it's our software, we utilize it in a certain way, and it's our data. Yeah, but you've just given up control, and it may not even be an issue associated with ownership. I think the fact that you own it is probably fundamentally sound. Though there's nuances that we can talk about with respect to that, but it's who controls what you do with that data, and what kind of charge or fee or revenue generating event is there for you accessing data that's in your ERP system just by the fact that it's in the ERP system. And you look at lawsuits filed against SAP and others where that has become a fundamental issue.
So I want to note a very important distinction that Marcus just made, because almost every executive gets this wrong. And that is that owning your data is not the same as controlling your data. Those are two different things. Yes, you might legally own your data. Technically and legally, maybe your vendor can't use that data without your consent in any other way other than just transacting processes. But that doesn't mean you control the data. And as I talked about earlier in this episode, I talked about the SAP API policy, where they're limiting how customers and when and where and if customers can use their data outside of the SAP footprint and ecosystem and the sanctioned ecosystem that SAP approves. I have pretty strong opinions about this. I think you probably know what they are. I'd love to hear yours, though. And here's why I have such a strong opinion here, because it's a trap. It's a customer trap. When you move to the cloud, you'll ask the vendor, is this our data? And they'll say, yeah, absolutely. It's your data. And again, technically, contractually, legally, they're right. You do own it. So you figure, okay, how difficult can this be? How much of a problem could this really be? But ownership isn't really the real question here. The real question is, who controls it? Do you have control of your own data? When your data lives in the vendor's cloud infrastructure, you have to ask yourself a bunch of questions. Who decides what you can integrate with it? What does it cost you to access your own data through a third-party tool? Are you going to pay for access to your own data? Chances are pretty high that you're going to, whether it's SAP or any other ERP vendor. What broad license did you grant the vendor to use it, including creating derivative works or training their AI models on it? That's a big one too. So many customers now have opted in to allow their ERP vendors to train their AI models on customer data. Now, on the surface, in short term, it's not a huge deal, right? Short term, big deal. Yeah, I want AI, right? I'm excited about AI. So in order to get AI, I feel like maybe I can or should need to train the vendor AI model or help train it. But what you're doing is you're just giving that advantage now. You're giving it away. You're taking your internal tribal knowledge, your internal intellectual property, and you're transferring it to the vendor, who then is going to transfer that to other customers and your competitors, by the way. So that's a big deal. I don't know why more chief legal officers, internal counsel, CFOs, internal auditors, I'm not sure why more people aren't stepping up to wave the red flag on this issue. If you are an auditor, if you're internal legal counsel, if you're a CFO, if you're an executive of any sort, just start asking these questions because they're really important ones. And by the way, I always go back to when I was in grad school getting my MBA, one of my favorite models, just because it's so simple and so fundamental to business strategy. It's Michael Porter. He's a famous Harvard academic, and he's written a lot of really good books. In my 20s, I used to obsess over this guy. I used to read everything he wrote, every article he wrote. I'd read his stuff because I really liked it, still like it. But he has this 5 forces model, if you're not familiar with it. And he talks about how every industry has 5 forces, and where you fall within these 5 forces, or how you navigate these 5 forces, is really important. And it also defines how competitive an industry is and how much of an advantage you might have within any particular industry. And one of the 5 forces he talks about is barriers to entry. How do you create high barriers to entry so your business model isn't easily replicated? And it's such a fundamental, basic thing. But I look back to, learning that in the 90s, thinking how brilliantly simple it is, but how important it is. And now you fast forward 30 years and I look up and say, why are so many executives just totally disregarding that idea and doing the exact opposite, which is I'm going to actually create lower barriers to entry for my competitors. And not only that, but I'm going to give them the tools. I'm going to help build the tools for them to make their jobs easier to do what I do really well and differently. I'm going to allow the vendors to create more of a homogeneous, easy to access, easy to enter industry for me. I would invite you to pause the podcast right there, stop and think about that for a minute, especially if you're an executive, and look around you and look at the decisions you're making, and look at, maybe unknowingly, is my team doing that? Is my team right now creating lower barriers to entry, which, by the way, is not a good thing. Your job is not to create lower barriers of entry for your competitors. Your job is to protect your competitive advantage. Your job is to erect barriers to entry so that it makes it harder for people to replicate what you do, so that you can take care of your business, take care of your employees, take care of your investors, take care of yourselves. And so many executives are doing the exact opposite of that right now. So that's the thing you've got to ask or think about as you think through some of these questions about data and control. And one more question I'll ask for you, somewhat rhetorical, but I'd love to hear your comments below. And that is, what happens to a critical business process if the vendor changes the software on their schedule, not yours? So in other words, they might change the software, whether you're ready for it or not, whether you want that change or not. You have no say. You don't have a say in most cases on whether or not your operations are going to change. So right now, you might be looking at demos from a software vendor and say, that's perfectly fine with me because I love the software. It's a great fit for what I need. And let's just say that's true. I would challenge you to and say there's probably a lot under the surface you're not catching that maybe isn't a good fit, and that's where the real risk is. But let's just say it's true. It is a perfectly good fit for your organization right now. The question is going to be, though, what happens if and when the software vendor decides to change the functionality of the software because they think it's best, because maybe some of your competitors are lobbying the vendor to change a certain function or whatever. Now suddenly you don't have control over that. You don't get a vote necessarily. You may think you have a say or whatever, but over time you're going to see this divergence between software vendor developing software a certain way, your operational needs going a certain way, and that gap, that chasm is going to grow. The only thing that's different today, which that chasm has been real, since the beginning of technology, but the difference today is, in the past, at least, you could do something to close that gap. I can go replace the software. I could customize or change the way I'm using it. Now you have less flexibility, and the switching costs are a lot higher. Getting out of your contract that you're about to sign, or the one you're signing right now with the software vendor, is a lot harder to get out of. It's going to be a lot harder to change systems in the future, and we have yet to see that day of reckoning come, which I think probably isn't too far off. It's probably 5 to 10 years out. We're going to see where we as an industry will be paying the price for the bad decisions we're making right now, even though those decisions seem like good ideas to all of us right now, to the vendors, to the system integrators, to the end customers. But I think 5 to 10 years from now, we will be paying the price, and it won't be pretty. But we'll have to bookmark this podcast, come back to that thought in 5 or 10 years and see if I was right or if I'm overblowing what I think is a really big deal. So you can still own something completely. Here's the lesson. You can own something completely and still have almost no control over it. And in the cloud, something that really matters is control. And Marcus said it really well. He said the vendor owns the infrastructure the data resides in, and that gives them a leg up over you, even though it's your data. So we have to stop asking ourselves, do we own the data, and start asking, how much control do we actually have? That's the question that the vendor doesn't want you to dwell for too long on. So we've got a lot more to cover. I want to get back into this conversation with Marcus because we're just getting started. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. If If you're about to embark on the jungle of digital transformation, check out my new book, Welcome to the Jungle. It's a book that just came out in late 2025. It's my second book, and it's a book that focuses on digital transformation failure case studies and talks about the lessons and takeaways from that. It's 300 pages packed of all the lessons and things that I've learned from having been an expert witness in lawsuits related to digital transformations, and also with our team helping clients recover some of their failed projects. I've included as many lessons I could possibly fit into one book here. You can read this book. You can order it anywhere in the world in hard copy format, which is this format here. You can get it in paperback. You can also get it electronically as well. Scan the QR code right here or go to the links below for your copy. Hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
So I want to show you this LinkedIn post that I recently posted, and it's just a quote that I came up with just in the last few days. And I want to get your feedback on this because I think it's really relevant to today's conversation. And that is, in a world that demands flexibility and hyper-personalization, cloud ERP and SaaS systems are forcing rigidity. It's simply not sustainable. That's my opinion, and I feel more strongly about this over time. I can't help but look at what's happening with look at Netflix, for example. Netflix has mastered this idea of delivering such a highly customized, highly personalized experience to its customers. And you could argue all day that, well, that's different. That's content. That's different than creating highly customized manufactured widgets or whatever. But I would argue to you, I'd submit to you that, the types of manufacturing companies we work with, the types of financial services companies we work with, even the government entities we work with, aerospace and defense. I mean, we look at all these different organizations we work with, and most of them are pursuing flexibility. They're looking for ways to satisfy their customers in very unique and different ways that is very different from their competitors. So going back to that quote, the world around us, in my opinion, is moving towards flexibility, towards hyper-personalization, hyper-customization. But yet the enterprise tech space is going the exact opposite direction. I can't quite get my arms around how that movement is continuing. Now, on one hand, I kind of get it because the money is there. Investors, if I'm an investor in a software company, I fully believe in this homogeneous, vanilla, generic technology model because it's so scalable. It's way more scalable to deliver a software product, or any product for that matter, that's very homogeneous. Ford back in the early 1920s mastered the art of mass production and creating Model Ts that were all black. And that was sort of their half joking comment, was like, you can have whatever Model T you want as long as it's black. because they mastered, the homogeneous way of producing black Model Ts at scale. Well, over time, obviously, we would fast forward 100 years. Now we all have different models of different cars, and even the same model has different variations, a million different variations. We can custom order our own car. Most manufacturers that we consult to, most manufacturers that I work with in my personal life, ordering products, most cases, I can get highly customized products, but yet ERP vendors are out there pushing, and customers, what's even worse, the customers are buying this model that's hamstringing them in many ways, to a old model, to an outdated model. I would compare it to the 1920s. We're acting like it's the 1920s and we're selling Model Ts. That's essentially what the ERP software industry is doing, in my opinion. But tell me what you think. Do you think that's right or wrong? Do you have a different take on that? And speaking of opinions, let's get back to the conversation here with Marcus. We're working with clients. A lot of times executives have this misnomer, this false belief that, the software is going to solve our problems in terms of giving us the answer in terms of how our processes should work, how our workflow should work, et cetera. And while that's true to some degree, it's giving you a tool set that might make your processes better. Just there's a fine line between leveraging the strengths of a software versus completely handing over control of your own operations, and your workflows to software vendors. And it's a fascinating dynamic. It's a sort of an organizational, not a dysfunction necessarily, but an organizational behavior sort of thing where executives want easy, technologists want to sell easy to the executives, and it all sounds good to everyone until you realize, wait, we no longer have control over our own operations, our own workflows, because now the vendors they're going to upgrade the technologies in what you think is going to be a good way going forward, but it may or may not be aligned with what you need longer term. So I think that's the control thing that's hard to see until you get into it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you've got to anticipate that and have people on your team that understand that that's a possibility, and try to contract around that. The goal is, in any contract that I negotiate, is to maintain as much flexibility as possible. You want all the indicia of ownership of that data, of that intellectual property, of the tool that you're accessing and utilizing, the software tool, the ERP set, without actually owning it. And that's a fine line to walk. If there's some key process that is important to your business, that the software has specific functionality that gives you a competitive advantage or is critical to your business, and because this is in the cloud, that functionality is modified, it's diminished in some way, or it's just different, that blows out that particular business process for you. What do you do, right?
Yeah.
You just spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on a piece of software functionality, and now it's changed, and that fundamentally impacts the way that you do business. You've got to account for that. And that goes beyond just owning the particular data or the intellectual property, but it goes to what you were saying about workflows and processes.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I first hear the term IP, I think data. I think competitive intelligence, like information about your customer list or your product information, really sensitive proprietary type stuff. When I hear IP, I think that, but there's also another layer that's a little less cut and dry. And this is part of what we were talking about before we went live, is you've got like the clear IP type stuff that if someone steals your customer records or information, that's clear IP violation and clear IP legal issues. But what we're talking about here is a little more nuanced, where it's like the vendors probably aren't going to get sued for taking your IP, but you're unknowingly giving them control over your IP in a lot of different ways.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think, look, you can break this down into a few buckets, right, of what kind of control you're giving up. And I think you're giving up broad rights to really use, analyze, and in some ways aggregate your own data and your own workflows, right? There's going to be some sort of implicit or even explicit license for that vendor to use your configurations, your custom reports, whatever kind of process mappings that you've got. They have the ability to utilize that. And if it's not explicit in the contract, there's certainly going to be some sort of implicit right for them to utilize it. And you may not know what they're using it for. And I think, it's an issue of giving up control of your intellectual property, proprietary information, data, trade secrets, And to the extent that they're going to use all of that information to train their artificial intelligence models, I mean, that's got huge implications for not only for your competitiveness, for the viability of your trade secrets, and really even potentially the ownership of your intellectual property. And that's without them taking it. You know, it's not a misappropriation. I mean, they're utilizing it, and there aren't the appropriate safeguards around it to in many ways, you know, to ensure that you've got not only, you know, ownership but control. And I think control is the big issue here.
Yeah, it is. And you know, one of the interesting cases that you and I were talking about before we went live here today was the SAP EU settlement agreement that just went into effect earlier this month, or maybe it was last month, I can't remember. Just in the last few weeks, they agreed to a settlement where the EU essentially was able to extract certain concessions from SAP in terms of how they handle third-party maintenance and some of the restrictions that SAP had related to leveraging third-party maintenance and the way they were back charging customers and that sort of thing. So that's maybe not intellectual property per se, but it's on the same, it's along the same lines in terms of control. You know, how much influence and control should a vendor have over your own operations and your own decisions versus you yourself. And what's interesting, and I'd be curious to get your take on this, being since you've been on both sides of the equation here, vendor side and customer side, it seems like in a lot of ways, customers are allowing and giving legal rights to vendors that are allowing them to have more control. Is that right? Or is there a gray area here where there might be litigation that comes out of this longer term?
Well, I mean, I think there's a gray area, and I think companies that are savvy are going to focus on control and ownership of data and intellectual property, focusing on control of inputs and outputs with respect to artificial intelligence tools specifically. And I think that's the right way to go about it. But you know, really, the issue is you're giving up the right to control what happens to your data, and you just, I mean, fundamentally, you just are. That's the nature of the relationship, right? You know, and you look at this kind of on a pendulum here. I mean, you develop something in house and it's all yours. Okay, well, some people do that. We've got an on-premise system that's stored on your space or in your space with your data in there. It's pretty controlled. Then you give up a huge aspect of the control of your proprietary information, data, trade secrets, and intellectual property when it all goes into the cloud. And I think if you're focused really, you know, on price, on discounts, time to value, you know, how fast the implementation is going to take, adopting so-called best practices, vanilla out-of-the-box systems, if that's what you're focused on, I mean, you're going to have a rude awakening when there is some sort of a dispute about, you know, what can I do with my data?
Mm-hmm.
How do I utilize it internally or even externally? And what other systems can come into that ERP software, utilize, access my data, be assured there's going to be a charge for it, right? And where's the value add? It's just, I don't know. It's just there and it's in their ERP system. So they own it. And now the system that is, and they control the access to your data. And again, you've got to account for that contractually and try to minimize the impact for that, because, you know, as many revenue generating events as that vendor can create, be assured that they will do that. And so, you know, the loss of control, I think, has massive implications, and revenue generating events is just one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another issue I think here that's similar in that, and this is and I can't remember if I don't think you and I have talked about this yet on a podcast in the past because it is relatively new, but SAP recently also published a new API policy that somewhat limits how customers can access and integrate with data that resides in S/4HANA. And in particular, they're essentially, what they're doing, in my opinion, is that they are limiting integration to SAP sanctioned products. So if it's a product like, for example, Celonis is involved in litigation right now with SAP because Celonis is suing SAP saying, hey, you used to let our product access data in your system. Now you're excluding us ever since you bought one of our competitors, which is true. They did buy a competitor called Signavio. Ever since SAP bought Signavio, then they've since clarify their API policy for security purposes, which I'm calling BS on. That is not why they're doing it. This is my personal opinion. I know you can't validate that or not because you're an attorney, Marcus, but my opinion is SAP is doing it because they want you to double down on the SAP ecosystem of SAP sanctioned products. They don't want you using a third-party competitor to integrate with SAP data. So the reason I bring this up is because it does beg the question. I've gotten into debates with people in the SAP community about this. Is it really SAP's data or is it the customer's data to make decisions on how you can or can't access that? And maybe part two of that, if you do have an opinion, or if you're able to provide an opinion, is security enough of a concern that SAP would have the right to say, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, you're not smart enough to make good security decisions for yourself, so we're going to make that for you? And I know that's a very loaded question. That's a totally biased way of asking the question, but, but I just want to.
It is, but I think you're right on. And look, I'm right there with you. I think the Celonis case is really a canary in the coal mine. You look at that and you see exactly what they are trying to do. This new API policy is another one where, again, and I feel like I'm sounding like a broken record here, but it's all about control and being able to leverage your access to your own data. SAP doesn't own that data. They own the infrastructure in which the data resides, and I think that fundamentally gives them a leg up over you, even though it's your data, right? And I think, to answer your question specifically, does security give them, some kind of fundamental right to dictate, how you can utilize or access your data? Well, I think it's a cover, to be quite honest with you. I really do. I mean, I think, are there legitimate concerns there? Certainly. But for them to dictate specifically, that you can only use SAP partners or SAP approved providers, that's, I think, problematic. And I think, it's done not, for your benefit, which it's done under the cover of, right? Okay, here's the data security issue and we're helping you out there, but it's done for their benefit to, put as many controls over that system and your data as they possibly can, and to extract as much revenue from that access as they can. And in fact, this is so rampant right now. I actually had an SAP employee reach out to me and call me, kind of a whistleblower type thing, and just kind of alert me as to what what SAP is doing and kind of where they're at. I don't know what I can do with this information, but I mean, I think it's interesting that, they don't, even their own people to some extent don't see where the value add here is and think it's problematic and not good for their customers. That's pretty telling.
Yeah. And I think, these are all, when we talk about these things, I think it's important to set the context of why it's so important. I mean, to be clear, I'm not suggesting in any of these conversations or these risks, the risks that we're identifying, I'm not saying that necessarily means that you should not deploy SAP or you should not deploy an ERP system of choice. But I think it's important to understand what the motives are of the software vendors and to understand how big of a conflict of interest there is and how big of a disconnect there is between what vendors want and need versus what customers want and need. And the reason is and actually this goes beyond just vendor versus customer. This also goes, we see this internally within and our end clients a lot too, business versus IT. It's really a business versus IT debate here. Of the technologist in me understands clean core and understands why we all want fit to standard. We don't want to customize. I get it from a tech perspective, but I also see enough business operational dysfunction to know that leads to a lot more dysfunction when you try to force fit your system into a clean core, fit to standard, vanilla cloud ERP system. You can call it best practice all you want if you're a purist, if you're an SAP or an ERP purist, but I've just seen too much reality where rubber meets the road with operations, where that generic vanilla system just cannot meet the needs of the business operations. And I think that's the real rub here.
Well, I think it really is a rub. And, the benefit to the vendor is that they get to sell, what is perceived to be, a cleaner way of integrating and implementing that software that's going to cost you less money. It's going to take less time than traditionally it would have, because they've got, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, SAP Rise, Clean Core, all these marketing buzzwords around the implementation process, which are all designed to make it seem less problematic or less complicated than it actually is, which I think does a few things. One is it sets up an unrealistic expectation that it's going to be easier or more simple than it really will be. And so the customer then devotes less resources than it otherwise would have to the implementation, thereby, creating the likelihood that that implementation is going to be more difficult and take longer and have more issues than it otherwise would have. So there's that. I think, there's also this issue with, standardization, vanilla out of the box, kind of the unrealistic expectations associated with that. And, I will tell you that when these things fail, often it's because, there was an over-reliance on this out-of-the-box mentality by the integrator or by the vendor. And then when they go live, the software doesn't do all the things that it needs to do because there wasn't appropriate customization or modification of that system to address gaps in functionality. And the response is, well, you've got to change your business to adapt to the software. And we see lawsuits like this where, well, the vendor washes, or the integrator rather, washes their hands of any problems that were supposedly in the implementation, saying, well, you didn't follow the process. You wanted to replicate what your old process did. And I think there's truth to both sides of that, saying, well, you can't over customize, and to also say, well, we need to customize the system to accommodate our unique ways of doing business. And the whole irony associated with this is, if you've got some sort of secret sauce or some sort of competitive advantage, and the vendor is telling you, don't worry about that, just adopt this out of the box, uncustomized system, you're going to preserve your ability to upgrade. You're going to be, financially better off in the future. There's some truth to that, but what are you giving up? You're giving up what differentiates you from your competitors, especially in the context of artificial intelligence. If you're putting all your workflows and your processes into these tools, and they're learning based on your data, and that that output is available to everyone that's utilizing the system in your space, what have you just done to your competitive advantage and your trade secrets? That's a huge issue.
Yeah, and it is interesting, and you and I were talking about this before we came on the show live a few minutes ago. But one of the things that fascinates me is, if we back up for a second and just say, what is the job of a leader within any organization?
Right.
They are certainly responsible for saying, hey, it's time for us to modernize our tech stack, which is what a lot of leaders are finding right now. But beyond that, they also, their job, I would argue, is to protect their intellectual property, not just in a way that doesn't get them sued, which I think that's where I've, a lot of discussions I've had with you or questions I've asked you before have really centered on, data and things that you could get sued over. But here we're talking about something that's like, it's not tangible. It's not easy to see, but it's almost like you're quietly giving away, or you're slowly giving away your secret sauce. It's sort of leaking out of the organization now because you're passing it on to a vendor. You're passing it on to your competitors unknowingly, because now you've trained the AI model that the vendor uses with your competitors. You've trained that same AI model to help your competitors. It may be helping you too, but you're also helping your competitors. And you have to look at that and say, am I being a good steward of my intellectual property and my core strengths and competitive advantages and things like that? It's not, and this isn't a tech discussion. This is more of a strategic conversation. I think that's what makes it so difficult to have the conversation.
Yeah. And I think, you look at this and what are you giving up, right? You're giving up your differentiated advantage, and that essentially is disappearing into the vendor's standard configuration, right? So you've given up what makes you a key force in your industry that differentiates you from your competitors. You've given that up for the sake of efficiency. And, what's the cost benefit analysis of that? I'm not really sure, but you've got to quantify that in some way, because I think, what executives are focusing on the bottom line of the implementation, right? They want the biggest discounts. They want the quickest time to go live. They want low costs, and you get all that, by adopting best practices, standardizations, vanilla out of the box mentality. But what's the trade-off? And I think the trade-off is, it's intangible, but it's there.
So one thing that should make every executive listening slightly, if not completely uncomfortable, is that the cloud is quietly and slowly leaking your secret sauce to your competitors, and you're enabling it. You're allowing it to happen. So think about how this works. Your competitive advantage, the unique way you operate, your proprietary processes, your hard-won workflows, that's your secret sauce. It's what makes you better than your competitors. And in the old on-prem world, you built that into your system and you controlled it, and everyone was happy and everything was fine. Well, then the cloud came along, SaaS came along, vendors came along and pushed really hard on this concept, this idea of vanilla cloud. And now we're moving to a vanilla cloud system with AI on top. You feed your workflows and data into the vendor's tools. The tools learn from your data, and that learning, the improvements that are enabled by that learning, become available across the vendor's customer base, including your competitors. So think about that. You're training the AI model that helps your competition. Yes, it helps you too, but you've taken the thing that made you unique and now you've poured it into a shared pool that homogenizes everything towards the same baseline. I'm assuming homogenize is a word, and if it's not, hopefully you know what I mean. But here's what makes it so dangerous is it never shows up on a status report. It's not a line item. It's not necessarily involving a lawsuit. It's not necessarily a breach of contract. It's just your competitive edge slowly dissolving into the vendor's standard configuration for the sake of efficiency and scale. And here's the kicker, removing technical debt. I'm going to come back to that technical debt point here later in the episode. But so often we view customization as a bad thing. Customization is bad. We should not do it. We should just use vanilla off-the-shelf software. And the technologist in me agrees with that. I think most software vendors would agree with that statement. But we have to look at it from a pragmatic business operations perspective. That's where the idea of vanilla generic AI doesn't work. So we're trying to be more efficient. So it's coming from a good place, but it's not a reason. None of this is a reason to avoid the cloud or avoid AI. I'm not suggesting just avoid technology because you might lose your competitive advantage, but you can be a lot more deliberate than you and other leaders in the space have been. There's a reason for you to be deliberate here. You want to identify your secret sauce, carve it out of the broad data licenses in your contracting. You could put guardrails on what the vendor's AI can learn from, because being a good steward of your IP isn't just about not getting sued. It's about not giving away the very thing that makes you worth beating. And, again, think of it from the perspective of how can we move forward with this modernization effort, even if we are to some degree using commercial off-the-shelf cloud SaaS software. That's okay, but maybe there's certain parts of your business where you deliberately want to not deploy a generic vanilla model, and you want to preserve what makes you better and different than your competitors. And that's where you want to look at potentially having something completely different than your competitors. And again, the technologist in me might be terrified by the idea of you custom building something, but the business strategy guy in me really likes it, because that tells me it's going to be hard to replicate. Only you own it. You're not allowing a vendor to tell you how you're running your business. You're creating what best practice is to you. You're creating your strategic advantage. And I think that's what the big takeaway is here, and the big question that every leader should be asking right now. I'm here with Marcus Harris. We're talking about intellectual property, what it means in this world of ERP and AI. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I met her in a club down in Old Soho, where you drink champagne and it tastes like Coca-Cola. C-O-L-A.
If you only attend one event this year, make it Digital Stratosphere 2026. It's our annual flagship conference. It's going to be September 9th through 11th in Denver, Colorado, the same location as we held it last year. It's 3 days where digital leaders, ERP practitioners, and transformation experts come together for no-spin, vendor-neutral conversations on ERP, AI, and digital transformation. There's no marketing fluff. There's no pay-to-play sponsorships, just real practitioners sharing real lessons. Go to thirdstage-consulting.com/stratosphere to learn more and register. Tickets are limited, and these always sell out, and I'd love to see you there.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
So here's something I want to show you before we get back to this conversation with Marcus. We're talking about intellectual property, but this is something that is somewhat related to intellectual property, but I think more than anything, it's just really interesting where the industry is headed. Now, I'll admit, before I show you this, I'm going to be honest. I used AI to create this, and it didn't turn out exactly the way I wanted. But essentially what I did, and if you're listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, I'll try to verbalize what's on the screen in front of us here. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to analyze, just over the last 12 months, what stocks are performing the best in the enterprise tech space and which ones are performing the worst. And actually, to be honest, what triggered this idea was that I would keep an eye on the tech space, and I had noticed recently, I knew that SAP and Oracle, as an example, were struggling. Their stock prices have been dropping pretty significantly over the last 12 months. And I wondered, what are the other stocks doing? So I did a analysis using AI, looking at July 15th of 25 through July 15th of this year in 2026, to look at what was the percent increase or decrease of all the different software vendors in the space. Now, the ones that are doing the best, the top three performers, are not the ones that I would have ever in a million years have expected or had guessed. And this is, I'll tell you in a minute where the graphic is broken, but this part's fine. So Datadog is a company that does data migration type stuff. They're up 86%, almost 87% over the last 12 months. CrowdStrike is up 72%, and MongoDB is up 58%. Never heard of two of those three. I know CrowdStrike. I was not familiar with Datadog or MongoDB, yet they are one of the highest performing stocks in the enterprise tech space over the last 12 months. Now, you may be wondering, what about SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, and all those guys? Well, SAP is one of the bottom performers. So SAP is down 46%, Oracle's down 47%, and HubSpot is down 57.5%. And the error in this graphic is that I could not for the life of me get ChatGPT to show the graph the way I wanted to, which is to show the percentages. It's a line graph for those of you that don't see the graphic. It's a line chart, and it just doesn't show the lines to scale, and it doesn't show them relative to one another. The percentage labels on the slide are correct from what I can tell in all the analysis I've done, but the visual representation is not. But the theme here is relevant. So that's interesting. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear from you all what you think. Would you have expected, SAP, Oracle, HubSpot to perform better? One interesting one that I looked up in this, and it was more of a middle of the road sort of result, was Microsoft. And what's interesting about Microsoft is, even though they're an enterprise tech provider, they're pretty well diversified. I mean, they've got Copilot, they've got D365, they've obviously got Microsoft Office. They're building heavily. They're involved in obviously AI infrastructure. So I think they might be a little different because they are so focused on AI and diversified enterprise tech services, that they're actually doing better than a lot of vendors out there. But I just thought that was interesting. And let's get back to this conversation with Marcus. We're talking about intellectual property as it relates to this world of ERP, AI, and cloud. Yeah. And, it's not something that shows up in a project status report or a board deck that you're going to go present to your steering committee or whatever. It doesn't show up there. And that's what makes it so tricky. But it's absolutely true, and it's absolutely happening to a lot of organizations without them realizing it. And,
right. I mean, your unique way of operating is what makes you successful. And if you're kind of, all devolving towards this homogenous baseline where that no longer exists, that just seems fundamentally wrong.
Yeah. And one thing I've noticed too, and this again is not just the fault of software vendors, I think it's also the fault of technologists in general, even the ones that work for the end customers internally. But one thing I've noticed is this labeling or this marketing spin that the vendors have done a really nice job with. It's highly effective, but it's very destructive in my opinion. And that is to label some of your secret sauce and your intellectual property, your competitive advantage. You label that as technical debt. You say, well, that's technical debt. You built the system to do something that's unique to you, and that's just technical debt. Debt is bad. You need to get rid of it. And to me, that's really dangerous. And again, that term is brilliant. Whoever came up with that term and decided to deploy it across the industry is very smart. They know exactly what they're doing when they say technical debt, because it has such a powerful connotation. But in my opinion, it's too powerful in the wrong way, because it's focusing on the wrong thing, which is customization is bad. I need to go to a modern vanilla system. And by the way, what also gets lost in this whole thing is all you're doing is just you're building new technical debt. You're spending money on new technical debt that 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you're going to say, well, that's technical debt. We got to replace it. So you got to get out of this hamster wheel of thinking I got to get rid of technical debt because you'll never come out ahead. But that's a whole nother it's a whole nother story. But what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it seems like, and again, this isn't necessarily something that leads to litigation or the need for an attorney, but it is very important to understand that.
Well, you know what? It does lead to litigation, and I'll tell you how. We had a lawsuit last year where we represented a distributor in the audiovisual space, and the vendor kept promising, that the software was going to meet all of their business requirements, all of their needs, and essentially what they wanted to do was just implement really what was kind of a minimally viable version of the product that would address kind of a company in the abstract that did what they did without really addressing any of the unique business processes or workflows that were unique to this company, because it was not part of the process, right? It wasn't best practice to do that, but that's what the company needed. And so you've got a situation where the gaps in functionality of what the baseline system can do are just massive, because it doesn't account for the unique ways in which this business does business. And so that leads to allegations of fraud, negligent misrepresentation, breach of contract, breach of warranty, and it becomes difficult to defend those cases in some ways, because you're right, this term is a brilliant term, right? Technical debt. How do you argue that all of this one-off customization that you've done to your system to account for unique ways that you do business is really efficient and a best practice? I mean, in the broad scheme, maybe it's not, but for this particular business in this particular industry, that's what differentiates them. And for them, it is a best practice. So how do you kind of balance those two needs? It leads to massive problems.
So I want to bust a myth here very quickly. And the myth that I want to dispute and the statement I want to make, or the claim I want to make, is that technical debt is one of the most effective and most dangerous marketing weapons in the entire industry. It used to be, in my opinion, it used to be best practices. It used to be best practices just drove me crazy. It still does, but it's sort of lost its luster over the years. And you can only be triggered for so long before you move on and get triggered by something else. And in my case, I've moved on from best practices to some degree, and now I'm definitely triggered by this concept of technical debt. But because I think the reason I don't like it, and the reason it bothers me, is because it is so effective. It's sort of like a misleading or a gaslighting term that it's not true, but is so darn effective that it drives you crazy. And that's the case for me with technical debt. Now, I've been in arguments with people, or debates, I should say, with people in the industry that totally disagree with me and say, no, technical debt is a real term. It has real meaning. And I agree. I've studied the history based on that debate. I did study the history. I understand where technical debt originated, where the concept comes from. I know what the intent in the meaning of the word is, but the way it's used and the way it's viewed so one-dimensionally is where I think leaders get into a lot of trouble, and people make a lot of bad decisions based on it. And here's the sleight of hand I'm referring to. The sleight of hand in the word technical debt is the operative term being debt. Debt is bad. Debt is something you're obligated to pay off. So when a vendor or consultant points at your customizations, the ones you built to run your business your way, and calls them technical debt, they've framed your competitive advantage as a liability you're required to eliminate. And how do you pay off technical debt? Well, you buy new software. That's just a convenient answer to the debate of what, if there is a debate, of what do we do about technical debt. Now, many of you listening may be saying, okay, Eric, that's assuming that customization was done for a reason. And I'll give you that. Most organizations we work with have a combination of technical debt or customization that was not necessarily, like, there was no real good reason for customizing the software the way they did. Now, having said that, there are also plenty of cases in just about every client we ever work with, plenty of examples where they did do it for a good reason. There's something different about their secret sauce that makes them different, gives them a competitive advantage. Now, the vendors will say to you, they'll gaslight you into thinking, well, you're the problem. If you're just resisting change and resisting best practices, I guess you're just happy with technical debt then, aren't you? And again, it's sort of a manipulation of words in many cases. And that's really what I want to get at here. And keep in mind too, I'm not advocating that all technical debt is good or bad. I'm just saying you need to understand the nuances and the gray of technical debt, because it's too easy to frame it as black and white. Technical debt is bad. less technical debt is good. I would actually submit to you some technical debt is good. You should keep some of your technical debt. You should intentionally do that, because if it houses your competitive advantage, your unique workarounds, the things that your competitors could not in a million years ever replicate, then keep it. Why would you give that up and just move to a vanilla system that your competitors could use as well? So let's flip it around. In the financial world, I mentioned this a minute ago, debt isn't automatically bad. Smart companies use debt to strategically grow, to invest, to leverage other people's money. And nobody in the corporate finance world says that all debt is evil. Talk to your CFO. Ask your CFO, is debt always bad? They're probably going to say, well, in moderation, it can be effective. You could use it, if you can use other people's money and not get too overextended or over leveraged, that could actually be a good thing. So nobody ever says all debt is evil in the corporate finance world, but yet we do that here in the world of technology. And why do we accept that framing for technology if we don't accept that in the corporate finance world? So here's the part that Mark has confirmed that should get your attention too. This actually leads to lawsuits. When a company gets talked into a stripped down vanilla system that ignores the way they do business, the gaps in functionality show up at go live, and the vendor washes their hands and says, well, you shouldn't have tried to replicate your old processes. That's technical debt. And then in the meantime, the business just can't operate because you've given up all those things that were unique to you, that were important to your operations. Now you've given that up. And then so lawsuits do actually happen as a result of that. So that was a good point of clarification that Marcus made in really correcting me and saying, because I think I framed it as, hey, this isn't necessarily a lawsuit legal issue. And he corrected me and said, no, actually it is. It can be. So that was a really good unpacking of how this concept can actually lead to not only failure, but potentially lawsuits too. So the other thing that the dirty little secret, another little dirty secret, I should say, in the industry is that even if you rip out all of your so-called technical debt and move to a shiny new vanilla cloud system, you're just building new technical debt. 5 or 10 years from now, someone will point to that system and say the same thing. It's like a hamster wheel. And in fact, I think it's even more risk nowadays, because I think with AI especially, the monolithic single ERP model is dying. I just don't think it's going to be around for much longer. And I've actually been wondering for 10 or 15, 20 years now, what would come after ERP? And I think we're finally at the point where we're seeing the end of a life cycle, and we're on the tail end of that life cycle of ERP. So if that's true, if you think there's a reasonable chance that statement is true and that risk is true, then why would you double down on the model that may be completely obsolete? It's like it's like if you were in the early 2000s or early 2010s, if you remember back then, it'd be like back then saying, you know what, I'm going to invest in a bunch of new mainframes. Like imagine doing that in 2015. 10 years ago, you would have said, hey, I'm going to invest in a bunch of mainframes. These mainframe sales reps are telling me that I've got too much technical debt. Mainframes are the future. I'm going to invest in it. Well, you've got to think for yourself. And in 2015, I'm being a bit hyperbolic here. I'm exaggerating the scenario, but it to me, I think we're going to look back at 2026, mid 2020s, and look back and wonder why were so many of us doubling down on this model that was clearly dying. And so that's another reason why I would not trust that you can just get rid of your technical debt and problem solved, because I think no matter what we do right now, we're inevitably creating more technical debt that will need to be repaid at some point in the future. It's just a matter of how long can we get away with it? How far can we extend that technical debt? So when someone labels your secret sauce as technical debt, don't just accept it. You have to ask yourself, is this an actual liability, or is this a thing that makes us competitive? Because for your business and your industry, that customization might be the best practice. What I think was funny, I don't think the person I was debating with thought it was funny, but I had a debate with someone online about, I tried to turn that on its head a little bit, the technical debt concept. And I said, well, let's think of it this way. Let's think about M&A activity or companies that are highly leveraged. There's companies that have financial strategies of using debt, other people's money, to grow their companies. And so how is this any different? I mean, you can use debt debt could be a positive thing. I mean, we all as consumers think, okay, I've got a credit card balance, I've got to pay off or whatever, it's bad. But businesses do it all the time. Businesses always use debt to grow their businesses or to invest with other people's money. So I always view it as you're doing it on the financial instrument side of things. Why not do it with your technology? Is that a terrible thing? And of course you get, people that think that that's pure blasphemy that I would even say that, being in the technology industry, but it's true. I mean, you got to look at where's my real value, and where's the real payoff, and where's the real risk, because you might just be replacing, you might be replacing technical debt, but now you're creating operational debt that's really hard to get out of, and you're sort of trapped in that situation going forward.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Marcus.
None of that is good, right? I mean, none of that is a benefit to the customer.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to turn to the audience. The audience has been eerily quiet. I thought I was having a technical issue, which is why I get up to get my iPad thinking I'm not seeing the stream, but now we're finally getting some questions come in here. But there's a whole thread going on LinkedIn right now about what governance framework to use for your public cloud environment and how do you ensure AI governance evolves quickly enough to keep pace with the rapid advancement of AI technologies. I'm gonna shift that into a more relevant topic for you, Marcus, which is, what are the ways that we can still leverage AI in our enterprise technology environments without giving up this control or giving up our IP in a way that helps competitors? Is there a way to use AI in a smart way that actually helps you but doesn't unintentionally help your competitors or take away from your own competitive advantage?
Yeah, and I think what you want to do is have an understanding of how their artificial intelligence tools and functionality really works. You want them to be able to explain to you, exactly what they do with the inputs and have some guardrails about what kind of inputs you're going to put into that artificial intelligence functionality. And I think, from a contract negotiation process, a governance process, if you will, which is what the contract is, I think you want to explicitly identify, whatever kind of key workflows that you have, what kind of key processes, and certainly trade secrets, with as much specificity as you can in the contract, call them out. And I think you want to carve those out of any kind of broad licenses that are granted to the vendor to utilize that information. A lot of times the utilization of that data is subject to some sort of broad definition of customer data. And it's just anything that you enter into the system, and they can do with that what they want. And where that's generally problematic when it comes to some of these key pieces of information. But if you, to the extent you can carve them out from that, I think you're going to be in a better position than you otherwise would. You want to have strict use restrictions on what that vendor can do with that information, deletion obligations upon the termination of that functionality, upon deletion upon the utilization of that data. You want to be able to audit your vendor to make sure that they're complying with these contractual restrictions that you put in there. You're going to want to have confidentiality provisions that have limitations on their ability to use that data for benchmarking and the like. That's kind of where I would start. And when I think of governance, as an attorney that negotiates these contracts on a regular basis, I'm thinking of utilizing that contractual process and the framework of those contractual obligations to govern what that vendor can do with that information. And I think if you go down that path, you're setting yourself up for success.
I'm here with Marcus Harris. We're talking about intellectual property in this world of cloud, ERP, and AI. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I'm Greg Benton. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer with Third Stage Consulting. And if you are embarking on your digital transformation journey or in the middle of that journey in 2026, you're going to want to see our digital transformation report. This latest edition really dives into a lot of the key trends that we're seeing in the marketplace and the ecosystem right now. It also highlights a number of the things that are happening with AI being an important component and integral part of the ERP systems that are leading the way right now. Also, the shift toward composable and best-of-breed cloud solutions is really accelerating the decline of monolithic ERP replacement. The opportunity to download the report is found at thirdstage-consulting.com. And you'll also find other tools that will help you in the initiatives and the business planning that you're doing for 2026. Don't leave phase 0 without it. Reach out today.
I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or free guide that we publish. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management, or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you, or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that'll allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 283. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. This show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting and produced by Major Tom Productions. So we're here with Marcus Harris. We're talking about intellectual property in the world of cloud, ERP, and AI. Question that just came in on YouTube that actually is going to set up a whole range of stuff I want to cover with you, Marcus. And this is a comment from John on YouTube. He says, with your 10 worst ERP failures, could those budgets have been better spent building a custom ERP via a software firm or in-house? Amazon, Walmart, and Tesla all did. And I love this question because it's the question itself is, in my opinion, the tip of an iceberg here. Because if we really go underneath the surface here, the question now becomes, let's look at history of enterprise technology and how companies have used enterprise technologies over the last decades. Which ones have been the most effective at growing their businesses, scaling their businesses with technology? And nowhere in my research have I found that there have been some wildly successful companies that grew their companies and became wildly successful because they implemented SAP or they implemented Oracle or Microsoft 365 or something like that. It's usually they created something that is really hard to replicate. And you look at these three examples that John mentions on YouTube: Amazon, Walmart, Tesla. Those are all three really good examples of companies that did the opposite of what we're talking about here today, which is they brought all this stuff in-house and said, we're going to build our own stuff. And I know, again, this is blasphemy for a lot of the technology industry. Why would you build stuff if you could just get it off the shelf? Well, here's why. It's because you're building, you look at what, like Walmart's a great example. Walmart completely revolutionized the supply chain management function back in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s. And they became wildly successful because they were so good at supply chain management. And they didn't do it by deploying SAP. They did it by building their own system, their own supply chain network, et cetera. So anyway, the reason I bring this up is because in the past, prior to say 2020, maybe the late 2010s, in the past, you would have your IP that you developed, your unique aspect of your ERP system. You would deploy it on-prem, you do some customization. Of course, the customization is a pain in the ass and the technologists don't like it. Vendor sometimes doesn't even like it, but you would do it a lot of times because you have a competitive advantage you're trying to retain. Sometimes, yes, you would customize things you probably shouldn't have, you didn't need to, but buried in there is probably some gems, some stuff that's unique to you. But now we're moving to a model that's moving away from that, saying, okay, customization is bad, it's technical debt, let's go to vanilla cloud systems, SaaS, public cloud, wherever you want to call it. And now you have limited flexibility to build those competitive advantages. And I don't think we're going to see the next Walmart, Tesla, Amazon, or whoever coming out of this cloud world. It's not going to be because they deployed a SaaS system. It's going to be because they did something that no one else can do that's very hard to replicate. But what are your thoughts on this? When you think about intellectual property and protecting and building your competitive strengths, how does it fit into the world of technology, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you look at that and with that analysis, I mean, I think you can't argue that, Walmart, Tesla, and Amazon, haven't revolutionized the way that they've done business in those particular industries. And you're right, they didn't do that by, implementing standard vanilla off-the-shelf software where, the concept of technical debt was minimized and seen as bad. And they adopted, SAP or Oracle's version of whatever best practices were for their particular industry. They did they did the things that we've been talking about, right? They embraced those things that made them unique. And whether you call that technical debt or not, it doesn't matter. There's value to that. And as an intellectual property attorney, that's where the competitive advantage is, and that's what you need to protect, because that is what differentiates you and makes you a great company. And again, if it's a race to the bottom by implementing homogenized cloud-based systems that have the same vanilla best practices for everybody, that's not doing your business any favors in some ways. I mean, I think it's efficient, it's cheap, but what are you giving up, for the benefit of that efficiency gain? And you're very much giving up, the future of your company in some ways. I mean, that sounds incredibly dramatic, but if you look at it in the context of this question, that's right there. And do you have, as a company, the financial resources or the technical expertise, to develop a software system that is sophisticated as Amazon's or Walmart's or Tesla's? The answer is probably not, and that's why most people don't do it. And whether your budget could be better spent on that or not, it's hard to say for sure. But I will tell you, if you have an ERP failure, not only are you dealing with the cost of the failed software that allegedly does not work and you can't utilize, you're dealing with the legal fees to get to recover damages associated with that implementation, which are going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then you've got to implement a new system. So, if you look at it that way, maybe you do have the budget.
Right. Yeah, because you could end up, first of all, to be clear, you can fail. It's easy to fail no matter what you do, whether you're using vanilla ERP software or custom dev. But, certainly custom dev, things can get out of control pretty quickly in terms of, recreating the wheel, building stuff from scratch, et cetera, et cetera. Now there's hybrid ways you can do that to mitigate risk that we could come back to. But I think the key here is that you can also, what gets lost in this discussion oftentimes is you can also really screw up a project by trying to force fit a cloud system that might look on the surface easier and cheaper to implement, because technologically it probably is.
Right.
Well, that's arguable. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But let's just say it is cheaper technologically. It might actually cost you a lot more operationally. We have a big client right now that has grown tremendously, largely due to the data center boom that's happening right now. And they've grown from right around $1 billion to $4 billion just in a handful of years. And so they've grown a lot. And we're helping them through an ERP implementation right now. And the biggest problem we're having with them right now is the front end of their configure, price, quote process, which is essentially the way you sell and then configure a product that you're going to deliver to an end customer. The way they do things is so different, so unique, and they're so good at it that no off-the-shelf software seems to be working. And so we're having a lot of trouble with that. We're trying to figure out, well, we've got to customize the thing. We've got to get a bolt on. We've got to customize that. Then we've got to integrate it back to your core ERP system. And it sounds like a technologist nightmare. And in many cases it is. But we look at the other side of this. You look at what the CFO is looking at, the COO, and et cetera, et cetera. They're saying, well, that's a showstopper. We're not just going to use the system off the shelf because we don't want to change anything technologically. We need to keep our competitive advantage. Yeah. And this is one top of mind sort of thing that we're seeing right now. We see it all the time with customers. You've got to make the decision that makes the most business sense, not just look at it through the technical lens.
Yeah, and I think that gets lost. You've got all these competing pressures, but fundamentally, this is a business tool to enhance your business and to give you a competitive edge. And so, if you're not getting those things out of it, then what's the point?
So here's a quick question for you. I want you to sit back and think for a moment and name a company that became a market leader just because they implemented SAP or any other leading ERP system. Just name one company. I'll wait. Kidding, of course, I won't wait. But let me know if you think of one, because I cannot name one. I can't name a company that, because of their choice to implement SAP and or insert big ERP vendor here, I can't name a company that was successful largely because of that. Now, I can name companies that saved money, they had successful implementations, they improved their business, but it wasn't core to their business model in any of these cases. It wasn't something that made them, who they are today and whatever. And you can't use ERP to become a market leader. And that's the point. You look at companies that genuinely revolutionize their industries, like the audience member mentioned. Amazon, Walmart, and Tesla were two of them that audience member just mentioned a minute ago. None of them got there by deploying a vanilla off-the-shelf ERP system and adopting someone else's best practices. They built their own capabilities. So Walmart revolutionized supply chain management by building their own system, not by buying one out of the box. Now, I'm not saying every company should go build a custom ERP system from scratch. That would be ridiculous. That would be reckless at best. But most don't have the resources or the expertise, and it's a great way to fail if you do it recklessly. That's not the lesson. That's not the thing I want to leave you with. But the lesson is that your competitive advantage will never come from the same software that your competitors buy, especially if you're using a vanilla cloud off-the-shelf system. A vanilla cloud system might be a necessary cost of doing business. It might tighten up your operations, but it's not going to be what makes you win. What makes you win is the thing that's hard to replicate. And that thing almost always requires some flexibility, some customization, some part of your stack that's uniquely yours. So as we race towards homogeneized, again, that word I made up, how about I just say homogeneous? So as we race towards homogeneous, one-size-fits-all cloud system, you have to ask yourself, if everyone in my industry is running the exact same vanilla software the exact same way, where does my advantage come from? Because I don't think the next Amazon or Tesla is going to emerge from a SaaS system that everyone else is using too. And by the way, there's a middle ground. It's not a pure build or buy. Platforms like Salesforce let you buy the core and build your own extensions on a common supported tool set. In those cases, you get the differentiation without the nightmare of a fully custom system that only you can maintain. And that's often the smart play. And it's not just Salesforce. It's you look at what NetSuite is doing. NetSuite is starting to open up their ecosystem to third-party developers and custom apps. There's platform as a service, workflow automation type tools. Rapid is an example that was founded by Jan Bond, who founded Bond Software years ago. So there's a lot of different systems that allow you to use a common tool set to create something that's unique to you, that is going to be hard to replicate because it's unique to you and it's your intellectual property. It's your secret sauce. HelloPilot says customizing Dynamics 365 these days is easy. I don't know if it's easy, but it's probably easier than it was, especially with Copilot and other AI tools you can use to be doing that. HelloPilot just makes a very wise suggestion saying that don't fail. Good advice. Do not fail. Right. Yeah, HelloPilot has all the answers. And actually, HelloPilot has another really good comment here. And thank you for the comments, HelloPilot. I'm kidding when I sound facetious like that. But HelloPilot says the market is changing. It's a mosaic world, and AI will allow easier customization. I think that's a huge point that we haven't really touched on yet. Customization is not what it used to be. It doesn't require as heavy of a lift as it used to. And now you've got more tools at your disposal to be able to customize or to custom build stuff. I'm not saying do it when you don't need to, but you've got to be strategic about when and where you do that. And there might be parts of your business where you need to do that. Are you seeing more customers that are heading down that path, or that are considering more custom build type stuff? Or
we're not necessarily seeing more custom builds. I mean, we're seeing the adoption of kind of traditional ERP systems that we've all heard about. But what we are seeing in another part of our practice is really the rise of vibe coding and software companies that are emerging where they appear to be credible threats to enterprise technology in the value add that they say that they offer is where you can essentially vibe code an entire back-end software system to run your business. And I think that raises a tremendous amount of intellectual property and legal issues, because the way the law is structured right now with respect to intellectual property is if the AI tool has created the output, that's not protectable from an intellectual property standpoint, certainly from a copyright standpoint. And there are nuances here that I don't want to go down the rabbit holes, but there's a general concept. This is accurate, and the implication for that is, okay, well, if I'm utilizing artificial intelligence tools to make customizations and modifications to address unique business processes that give me a competitive advantage, you have to understand and acknowledge that you may not own those modifications and extensions that you have developed. They may not be protectable at all. And so, what do you do with that? You've got a unique process that is protectable, that is facilitated by a piece of functionality that fundamentally is not protectable. And so anybody then could take that piece of functionality and replicate your trade secret. And it's a huge issue.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I don't recall a client ever bringing up that topic or that question, that risk, that concern.
Yeah.
Very telling.
Nobody is thinking about that at all. And I think this area of law, intellectual property ownership with respect to artificial intelligence is rapidly evolving. I think it's starting to kind of mature, but where it's going to end up, we're not exactly sure. But right now, the state of the law is if there is not substantive human intervention in the development of that modification or customization, and it's done primarily by artificial intelligence, the artificial intelligence modification that you have developed is not protectable from an intellectual property standpoint. And so what does that do to your competitive advantage? So, I think AI in the context of software development is certainly transformative. And I think, it does and will make modifications and customizations easier, but the ownership of those modifications and customizations is really a question mark.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few questions over here on LinkedIn I want to get to in just a minute. But before I do that, one thing that I forgot to mention earlier, but it's better late than never, is that, Marcus, you're going to be speaking at our annual Digital Stratosphere Conference coming up in September in Denver, Colorado, September 9th to 11th. It's our seventh or eighth one, and you've spoken at and sponsored every single one of them. So again, not only are you the most most frequent guest on this podcast, but you are also the most frequent speaker and sponsor of our Stratosphere event. You helped us put together the very first one and have done so ever since. But you're going to be speaking at it again, and Taft Law will be involved again. So really excited to have you guys, and I do want to invite the audience here to learn more about the conference, because we just published the agenda, the speaker list. You can scan this QR code right here, and it'll take you to the event page where you can learn more about that event. But you can join it in person in Denver, get to meet Marcus and I and a bunch of other speakers. If you can't be here in person, you can also join remotely. You can buy a virtual pass where we'll stream it live. We take questions from the people on the stream as well. So really hope you guys can make it. Just scan this QR code if you want to learn more about it. And it's a great event. It's a lot of fun. It's a good networking, good peer networking, good lessons from other people. And it's also independent tech agnostic. So it's not meant to sell you on any software of any sort. It's meant to just help you understand some of these lessons we're talking about here today.
Yeah, I can't speak, highly enough of this event. It's something you have been involved in as a firm and me personally since the very beginning. And there's a reason for that. We believe in it. The speaker lineups are almost always amazing. You've had Jan Bond in a couple of them. His insights are always super interesting. Emma Roloff, I think, has been a past sponsor as well and speaker. I haven't looked at the lineup yet, so I'm not sure if those people are speaking this year. But you're always in for a treat in the educational value of the conference is really high. And I think, if you're about to embark on a digital transformation, you're in the middle of one, or one is on the radar, this is, I would say, a must see or must attend type of event. So what you're getting into. You've got insights from leading experts in the field. So it's a good event.
Yeah. And love to see you all there. It's a good time. And I learn a lot every time. I love doing it. And even just seeing you speak, I've seen you speak so many times. I've had you on this podcast so many times, and every single time I learn so much. So, me who've heard you speak 20 times or more or whatever, through conversations and presentations, I still learn. So I think no matter how smart you think you are, or that you might actually be, there's always something to learn here with this group that we have. So here's I want to get to some questions and comments here on other social media outlets here. Alina says IP stands for International Project. No, it stands for intellectual property. I can't tell if she's kidding or serious, but just in case anyone here is questioning, what does IP stand for? It's intellectual property, at least the IP we're talking about here.
Right.
Question or a comment from Serge, building on what we just talked about. Serge on LinkedIn says, if the make or buy analysis says build, you should build. The one caveat I'd throw in here to what you're saying, Serge, I totally agree with you. I would just say the analysis itself needs to be done by someone other than your software vendor that's trying to sell you software, because they're gonna put together a business case that's gonna show you how amazingly powerful that ROI is gonna be if you don't build, if you just use the buy aspect of things. And the other thing too, one thing I haven't mentioned that I think is worth noting here is when we talk about build and buy, it's not either or necessarily. There's a hybrid, sort of a gray area too. You could do a partial, buy a platform, like for example, Salesforce. You can go buy Salesforce as your CRM system, but then you also have access to the entire platform of third-party apps and tools you can use to either build your own apps on the Salesforce platform, even outside of CRM, and or you can go find someone else who's built a third-party app on that platform. So you can do it in a way that leverages common tools and gets you out of that risk of having this system that only you know how to operate, because you have other people in the ecosystem that know how to use it. So there is a hybrid there you can do too, which I think a lot of companies gloss over, don't realize. Let's see. Oh, here's a good question that's right up your alley, Marcus. This is from John on YouTube. John says, if you're implementing a major off-the-shelf enterprise software system, is it a best practice to hire a contract or governance attorney? If so, how and where in the world could I find one? I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, Marcus.
Yeah, look, you need to hire somebody that's experienced in contracts. Ideally, it should be an attorney, but I think what you really want is you want to kind of have a three-tiered structure to the way that you're going to adopt the software. You want to have, in my view, some sort of, I would say, a tech agnostic consulting company that is going to help you select the software, develop an RFI or an RFP, something along those lines. And this is best practice. I don't think you need to do all of these things every time, but certainly this is the way you should do it, in my view. And Eric, maybe you might disagree or have some additional tips. So I think getting somebody to help you with selecting the software that is going to be a good fit for you is important. And then you're certainly going to want to have somebody that is going to review that contract from a legal perspective. This is a specialized industry, and I think you're going to need to do a search engine search for firms that practice ERP, contract negotiation, law. There aren't a ton of them, so if you're going to have a handful of choices, I think then you're going to want to vet them, get customer references, client references, and get a good fit, understand the way that they look at these agreements. And again, you want somebody that is going to be able to point out issues, but really, look at those issues from a practical perspective, holistic perspective, understand the risk that they present, and give you good, solid advice. Just because something is a risk for most of their clients doesn't mean it is a risk for you. And so it's not a cookie cutter approach necessarily. And then I think you're going to want to go back, to some sort of an expert that's going to be able to advise you on pricing, discounts, see if you're getting a good deal and trying to negotiate that type of a structure. The attorneys are going to be able to give you general advice around, what they think a deal looks like, but that's not really in their wheelhouse. They're not so concerned about the numbers and, the kinds of future options that you're getting and whether it's a good deal or not. Somebody like a Gartner or somebody along those lines, I think, is probably a good option. So yeah, you do need, experts on your side. And you've got to understand too, the contract that you're going to get from any vendor is going to be one-sided, unreasonable, shift all the risk of that software acquisition or implementation to you and minimize their risk. And if something goes sideways during the implementation or your use of that software, that contract's not going to serve you very well if it hasn't been reviewed and negotiated. And again, you're trying to give yourself a dog in the fight by modifying that contract in a way that gives you some leverage and really functions as a tool to govern your relationship with that particular vendor for the duration of the project and for your use of that software. So that's how you do it, in my view.
Yeah, and I think one thing that along those lines too is that, and I totally agree with everything you just said, and what it triggered in my mind though is how what you said is even more true today than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago, which it would have been true then too, but even more so today because the enterprise technology space, in my opinion, is becoming a lot less flexible than it used to be. Yes. Not just in terms of the software itself, but contractually too. Right. Contractually, you have less leeway. In fact, we were talking about this before we went live on the air as well. Tell me what your thoughts are. Like, what trends are you seeing from a contractual leverage and negotiation perspective as it relates to software vendors here in 2026?
Yeah, and that really comes down to the question of how negotiable are these contracts and how much can you change? And it really comes down to, a key element, and that's how much money you're spending, right? If you're spending $100 million with SAP or Oracle, they're going to be a lot more flexible in dealing with requested changes to those contracts than if you're spending $100,000. And I think if you're on the lower end of the software spend, the reality is you don't have a lot of leverage, and the likelihood it's going to be more of a take it or leave it kind of attitude is really high. If you're spending a reasonable amount of money, on a critical piece of software that's going to run your business, you want to make sure that you know what to ask for. And you need somebody experienced in this. I'm not trying to tout my experience or say, pick me for this, but you're going to want to be dealing with somebody that knows how Microsoft operates from a contractual standpoint. You're going to want to know or deal with somebody that knows how Oracle or NetSuite operates and what they can ask for, based on the leverage that you have. And it's highly inflexible right now. And the mantra from most of these vendors is, well, we don't change our software because this is a delivery model that is company wide and across our customer base, so we can't accommodate one-offs. That is a lie. Okay, that is not true. Certainly, you're going to be able to modify warranty obligations. You're going to be able to modify limitations of liability, put carve-outs in there for data security breaches, confidentiality disclosures, those types of things. You're going to want to have solid remedies for breaches of warranties. You're going to want to be able to get out of that contract and know what happens, get your data out of that contract. So, there's a lot that can be negotiated. You just need to know what to ask for and what a vendor is most likely going to accept. And that's where, the real value add utilizing people that have done this before comes from.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, this is becoming even more true as well over time because, I think you look at the mass amounts of money that are to be made in the enterprise technology space. That's when you start to see irrational. Well, it's actually very rational, but it may seem irrational to people like you and I, Marcus, because we look at it more from the customer perspective and you think, well, why would a vendor do this? And then if you stop to think, you're like, well, it's because they're going to make so much money. Yep. If I can get everyone to a homogeneous model, if I can get everyone onto my cloud SaaS solution, it's easy for me. I can scale that. I'm more profitable. Investors love it. I get heavily compensated as an executive if I can get more people on this recurring subscription model. So there's a lot of money that drives irrational, but also very rational behavior that, in my opinion, harms customers. And I think more than ever, you need someone who's just on your side. They're not here to make vendors happy or to have a bias for or against any one vendor. It's more about the only bias. You should have advisors whose only bias is to make sure you succeed. That's all that matters. It doesn't matter what software you buy. It doesn't matter how you do it or how you get there. It's more, are you going to succeed or not? And that's where I think people like you and I can help.
Yeah, 100% agree with that.
Yeah. John said, thank you, gentlemen, on your time and advice. FYI, I ordered your first book, EK. Thank you for buying it. Buy all three while you're at it. I'll sign them for you if you do that. So, but that's a good start to buy the first one. Lena said, thanks for the clarification. Has to drop off. She wants me to like and comment on her post. And everyone watching here, if you follow Lena Karloviskia on LinkedIn, be sure to like and comment on her post. And then one last question, and then we'll wrap it up here, Marcus. But this is an interesting thing because I think this is a good question, but it also raises doubt to what you and I have been talking about here today. And this is from Lean on LinkedIn. Lean says, but who's responsible for AI vibe code when things go wrong? And this is a valid point, but I also think that it's a big enough fear that a lot of companies will say what you just said, Marcus, and what you said, Eric, about custom build and creating your own proprietary technologies. It's a terrible idea because I don't want to have to manage that going forward. Especially if I build it using vibe code or whatever. Yeah. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, it is a risk. It's a real cost, but how do you navigate that?
Well, I mean, again, I don't want to go back to the contract, but I will. And if you look at the disclaimers, the limitations of liability, the indemnity obligations in these types of contracts, and I'm talking about AI contracts specifically, and contracts in the ERP space that are dealing with AI functionality, they disclaim almost all responsibility associated with artificial intelligence outputs, which is what we're talking about. In my view, I mean, you can go a few different ways with this contract, or this comment rather. But if you put in certain inputs to generate code, and that outputted code is problematic, be assured that vendor is going to wash their hands of any responsibility for it. So who's on the hook when things go wrong for that? You are. And you're not going to have very many contractual rights to go after the vendor if their contractual obligations are going to end with their build of the system, the functionality that you're utilizing to generate the outputs. That's not true with every vendor, and there's ways to get around that from a contractual perspective. But this is why it becomes important for somebody to look at these documents, because they can account for these things and try to give you, some reasonable path forward if something does go sideways. And I don't. It's going to be challenging to hold any AI vendor's feet to the fire for outputs that go sideways. But there is language that you can put into those contracts that is going to mitigate your exposure, to their ability to just walk away, and you maximize your ability to hold them accountable for it.
Yeah. So that's good advice. What advice would you give if you could, just as a capstone closing question here, if you could spend 60 seconds in a boardroom with the executive team as they're making their decision to move forward with the digital transformation or a big IT investment of some sort, what would the headline advice be that you would give to an executive team as it relates to all the stuff we're talking about here today?
I would dumb it down, and I would say think about two things primarily. Think about flexibility and think about control. Okay. You want to be able to utilize this software in ways that make sense for your business. So that gives you the flexibility. All right. Flexibility meaning that you can run your business the way you want to run your business, embracing your technical debt to the extent that it makes sense, and flexibility to avoid revenue generating events that are unexpected input on to you by that vendor. You're going to want to have some clarity as to what your costs are going to be over the lifetime or the life cycle of your utilization of that software tool. And then with respect to control, it really is, how do I control my data? How do I control what I'm putting into that system? How do I get it out? What costs are there associated with me utilizing my data in that system, and what's the value add? So for me, at a 10,000 foot level, it's really flexibility and control. And if you focus on those two things fundamentally, everything else should fall into place.
Well, that's really good advice. I want to hone in on Marcus's closing advice, because if you remember nothing else from this episode, you just want to remember those two words that he said right there: flexibility and control. Really important. I think it's brilliantly said. I don't know that I could have summarized it better myself. And let's talk about both of them here. Flexibility, it means you can run your business the way your business needs to run, not the way the software dictates. It means you're embracing the customization that makes sense for you, and you're doing it selectively, but you're doing it deliberately. And it means you're avoiding the surprise revenue generating events where a vendor charges you to access your own data down the road. And it also ensures that you have access to the data and you have access to other third-party systems, and whatever you want to do with your business operations and your data, you should be able to do. You should not allow a software vendor to dictate to you how you can or can't run your business. That's my opinion. Now, you talked about flexibility. He talked about control, flexibility and control. Control means you decide what happens to your data, how you put it in, how you get it out, who can access it, what it costs, what the vendor's AI is and isn't allowed to learn from. And here's why it matters so much, and that is that one of three parties in any digital transformation, the vendor, the consultant, and you, the end customer, two of them are guaranteed to win. The vendor makes their money, the consultant makes their money. The only party carrying the real risk, the real operational risk, the one who has to live with the system for the next decade or two is you. You're the end customer. You're going to be dealing with the good, the bad, the ugly of this for years to come, long after the sales reps have cashed their commission check, long after the consultants have taken home their money, long after and during, while you're still paying the SaaS vendor, by the way, you're going to be paying them for years to come, whether you like it or not. So they'll be happy you're still alive on their software because you're going to be paying for it forever. So if you're the one bearing all the risk, why would you give up flexibility and control? The easy path is just give me best practice, just let the vendor handle it. It feels simpler in the short term, but that world doesn't actually exist, and it's definitely not a good long-term play, no matter how hard it's sold to you. So if there's one thing we can leave you with, you want to optimize for flexibility and control, get everything else, the pricing, the timeline, the discounts, advised by people whose only bias is your success. And I will admit I am accused of being biased all the time. I'm being biased for customers, and sometimes that means I'm biased against vendors and system integrators, and that's why, because I only make money from customers. I'll be 100% transparent and shameless about that. I am biased towards our customer needs because they are the only ones I make money from, and that's the way the world works. We're all making money from someone, so that's where the bias lies. And that's why when it comes to pricing, timeline, discounts, long-term flexibility and control, you want to be advised by people whose only bias is your success. If you do that, as Marcus said, everything else will fall into place. So hope you enjoyed the conversation. Hope you join us at Digital Stratosphere 2026. You can meet Marcus and I both there. You'll meet a dozen or so other speakers. Hundreds of other peers will be there to interact with, engage with. So love to see you there. Again, go to Stratosphere 2026. I'll pop up the QR code here and include links below. You can learn more about the agenda, the speaker lineup, et cetera, et cetera. Be sure to check it out. Look forward to seeing you there. And be sure to check out past episodes of Transformation Ground Control. Just go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can find all the past episodes there. You can also subscribe to listen or watch every week, whichever platform you prefer. We've aggregated it all on that one website, transformationgroundcontrol.com. So hope you all have a great week. We'll see you next week. We'll see you next time. Take care. Thank you.